Okay, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Chris Ogier. I'm the Vice President of Federal Business Development and Government Affairs at Sanborn Geospatial. My background is photogrammetry. I'm a certified photogrammetrist. I've been involved with the USGS and the 3DEP program really since its inception, and so we've kind of come up with hopefully a nice recipe for anyone interested in either applying this year or looking at next year potentially as an opportunity to look at acquisition of LiDAR or now 3D HP. So the three-dimensional hydrographic program is now in play for these types of grants, although I can tell you it's not as well funded initially. So today we're going to talk a little bit about using the different vehicles for contracting this. So the Geospatial and Professional Services contract that the USGS has in place versus become a cooperative technical program partner, right? A CTP, where you would typically manage that yourself. The 3DEP versus 3DHP distinctions, people often get those confused these days. We want to make sure we distinguish between the two and talk about how to budget for this, how to cost share for this. So there's some specific rules that you need to be aware of, but also some opportunities. I see some familiar faces and familiar names out there, and whether you're a GIO of the state, you're working for a state, whether you're working for a COG, whether you're working for a water entity, right? There's all kinds of opportunities to partner with both federal, state, and local entities. But the sooner you get started on that in any given budget year, the better. And so we'll talk a little bit about quality level standards, what LiDAR is, what it isn't in terms of opportunities for accuracy levels, water flow studies, where it's appropriately used, and what the expectation is from the USGS in terms of meeting spec, in terms of cooperative funding here. So we'll talk a little bit about how to create your area of interest. There's not rocket science here. I think most people on this call are GIS professionals or at least have been involved in mapping for a long time. But there are specific rules and things that have to be adhered to make sure any submission to the USGS meets spec and increase the odds of being funded. There is an application process, as there is with any federal application for funding, and there is a deadline approaching. So we don't want to rush anyone. If you're interested in getting something submitted this year, there still is time. September 13th is the deadline, but I want to iterate now that it's a rolling process. So if we got something in by September 13th, really you have till, as long as the USGS is amenable and the funds are available, we really have until the end of the year, but we would need to get something put in place by the 13th. Typically for us, that's an assist to you, where we would be helping you either write, put together your costing, all that information that the USGS would need so that you can submit. If you don't want to submit this year, that's fine. This is a perfect time to be looking at next year, because this is a data collaboration announcement that comes out every year. It will be a year following an election year, which is usually favorable for funding for these kinds of things. But either way, we want to make sure you understand this is an ongoing process. So if you're planning for next year, we can help you there too. And then how to add value on top of this LiDAR data. Most of you probably are fully aware of most of the benefits of LiDAR, but the ability to fuse this data with imagery data to pull out all sorts of information, environmental information, water flow modeling, building footprints, building outlines, anything that is applicable in a three-dimensional nature is good fertile ground for this type of data. So there's all sorts of uses for this data popping out of the woodwork as we speak. But this program, first off, is the data collaboration announcements. It used to be called a broad agency announcement, but this started in 2010, 11. And it's really the whole goal of the 3D National Topography Program was to map the entire United States, including Alaska and Hawaii and Marianas Islands, Guam, Palau, American Samoa, those areas with a standardized elevation model. And we're through that first iteration, 90+% of the continental US has been mapped. But now we're to the second iteration. There's data that's older now. So anything over 5 years now is reaching sort of the end of its shelf life for use because of development, because of changes in terrain, other things that influence particularly hydrologic modeling where river channels change over time. So we're going to kind of focus on that today. But Alaska, for example, was mapped with IFSAR. It has its own challenges from collection of LiDAR, but they are looking hard at Alaska now for LiDAR as well. And we're doing projects there too. And the whole goal of FY25 this year and 26 will be to fill in the gaps, in particular on aging data. So that would be anything over 5 years. Next. So our DCA experience, there's two maps here. One is on the left showing where we've helped clients, Denver Regional Council of Government, Pierce County, Washington, that's the Seattle area, areas of California, New York, Texas, Arizona, Michigan. There are others, but the map here on the right really shows where we've been doing LiDAR projects really over the past few years. We are nationwide, so we definitely push the envelope in terms of acquisition and processing of LiDAR data. We are a USGS GPSC prime, so we're doing thousands and thousands of square miles per year. Last year, I think we were on the order of 60,000 plus square miles of USGS spec data. Not all of it was done for federal clients, but some of it was. And because we understand the specification, right, we can help you move through this process quicker, and we have good relationships with the USGS. Next. So if you boil down how to apply for a USGS funding mechanism through the DCA, right, there's really allocated through two channels, one of which is the GPSC, the Geospatial Professional Services contract, which the USGS manages directly, or you can request Sanborn directly through a cooperative agreement where you, the state, the local, the county, the COG, could be any entity other than the federal government manages it yourself, or you take on more of that role. You can request Sanborn either way. The only guarantee for Sanborn is through a cooperative agreement, but I've seen it go both ways. Both methods have their advantages. Both methods have their pros and cons. So I don't want to recommend one way or the other here. We're just going to go ahead and tell you what the differences are and let you make decisions based on best knowledge we can give you. So typically, though, 80% of the USGS dollars will be directed through their own contract. There's a variety of reasons for this, but at the end of the day, that's been the average historically. Next. So the mechanisms. So the Geospatial Professional Services contract, again, Sanborn is one of 10 prime contractors on that contract. The USGS would manage most of the details. So you would provide your portion of the project funding because this is cooperative funding. Remember that. The USGS won't fund 100% of anything. This is the idea here is that we get more bang for our buck through group strategies whereby joint funding strategies get more data provided. It's a multiple award acquisition vehicle, as I said, and we're one of 10. The acquisition processing and the quality assurance of LiDAR is guaranteed, right? And the USGS prefers partners use the GPSC when possible and practical. They have a team of folks in both Rolla, Missouri and in Lakewood, Colorado that do the quality assurance and quality control on the data. It's a guaranteed mechanism, right? There's less overall risk in the project, although there's some downsides to that too. The cooperative technical partnership, right, is financial assistance awards whereby you, the client, would apply directly, right, and then essentially manage everything. The applicant is responsible for securing the contractor to do that, and the USGS always prefers their own contractors, but you can choose your own if you like. The data must adhere to the base specifications for the USGS LiDAR base spec, which has quickly become the national spec anyway. So for most people, they would be comfortable with that, but we can talk about that. If we can actually exceed the spec and run it through contract vehicles, but the USGS is only willing to pay for up to their specification. So I don't want you to think that can't exceed that in terms of point density, in terms of other types of data run through a contract vehicle, but they're only willing to pay and match funding for their spec. So next. So let's talk about a side-by-side comparison. Again, we make no judgments as to which direction is better. They both have pros and cons. The USGS, the Gypsy 4 Prime, which we can contract either way here. The USGS would manage the project. They'd handle the financial pieces of that in terms of rolling up through their contract. They would own the project during the execution and manage the contractor doing the work. It's less administrative hassle for you, and it's the vendor partners manage the actual work. If we would be one, we would do that. If our competitive mates win the work, they would do the same. The cons to that, it's typically a slightly higher upfront cost. When I say upfront, meaning the per unit cost up front is higher, but again, remember you're not managing it, so it's more boxed in terms of a one size fits all, and without as much hassle. So you have to weigh the pros and cons of that. There's typically less schedule flexibility. In other words, once the schedule is published, getting data early, requesting specific things and specific data products throughout the process that aren't prescribed at the time of kickoff is harder to do. And the QA/QC process can be longer depending upon the backlog at the USGS. So those are some of the pros and cons. On the cooperative contract, again, the entity, if you're a state, you would be responsible for the actual project management of that. That comes with pros and cons of its own. The contracting and financing is yours to manage. The USGS would provide their matching funding, and then you have to manage and report based on that. And then the ownership of the project during the execution is yours to manage. Lower upfront costs. Typically, the unit costs are lower here. There's definitely more flexibility on schedule. And there's more flexibility for early deliveries. So there are trade-offs there. Or if you ask for an early delivery that wasn't planned in one of these contracts, that can affect schedule on the back end. We've seen that, but there's certainly more flexibility for the request, if that makes sense. Some of the cons are, more hands-on approach to contracting management and QA/QC. So we've seen entities have to mention or hire their own QAC contractors, and that's fine. I did want to remind everyone too, we're taking questions via the chat or the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. So feel free at any time to type questions in, and I'll be happy to answer them at the end of the actual presentation. So next. So I need to distinguish here. This year was the first year that they've allowed both 3DEP, which is the LiDAR collection, right? And then 3DHP, the three-dimensional hydrographic program applications are allowed. So you can apply for, either path here. So 3DEP, if you just need base LiDAR collected and you want to upgrade, maybe you've got 5-year or older area, we can do that. The 3DHP, which is more of a modeling contract where we go in and we edit existing LiDAR data or collect new data and edit on top of that, we're allowed to do that too. So elevation-derived hydrography is a thing that's here to stay, and that program is really, really becoming more and more mature in how it's being used, and we're excited about that. I can tell you that funding this year is definitely weighted and slanted more towards the LiDAR than 3DHP. But if you have a particularly contentious area or an area that is of interest to the feds, and you want to get the water modeling done through elevation-derived hydrography methodologies, 3DHP may be a method for it. This first year they've done that, but it's indicative that for the future, you'll see more and more funding opportunities for 3DHP type work. And we've done this work, and we're currently working on this in Alaska. We've got some work we'll be doing in the Northeast United States on this. So it's an interesting move forward. So, we didn't just collect the entire country over the last 15 years for LIDAR with LIDAR and not expect to have to study the hydrology. The nice thing is we've now got the base data to be able to do that. And so 3D HP applications are allowed, but you can't mix and match. You have to do one or the other or both. If you want to apply for both, you can, but you have to do two separate applications. So next. So cost share is always an evaluation factor as to what gets funded. The USGS just won't contribute more than 30% itself as an agency or as an entity, and no more than 50% by statute can be contributed from the USGS. Now, other federal agencies can contribute. We've seen FEMA contribute. We've seen the USDA, NRCS contribute. We've seen federal highways contribute. So there's all sorts of other federal agency opportunities that you can bring in, but the more time we have to pursue that and get the partnerships together, the better off we're going to be. But it could also be private entities, so power companies, utility companies, as long as they are willing to share the data. And what we've seen there is as long as they're willing to contribute financially, we can collect at a higher point density, for example, for utility X, as long as they understand that we're going to deliver that data to the USGS as a sharing arrangement at 8 points per square meter or whatever the agreed upon quality level is. If they pay for the extra density, they would get to keep that on their own. So there's all sorts of issues that come up. Putting these partnerships together, it can be time consuming, it can be complex, but we're used to it. So what I would say is get in touch with us earlier than later. And we oftentimes have our ear to the ground, with entities out there. You never know, as do you guys. I'm sure you're used to it. I'm sure each of you has its own grants coordinator or people that you communicate with looking for funding opportunities. We've seen other recent funding opportunities through NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So if you're a coastal state or a state that borders the Great Lakes or the Mississippi River, we can talk, and NOAA may be able to help contribute with you there. So next. So just some things to think about for uses of 3DEP, which is, remember, the base LIDAR and 3D-HP. Hydrologic modeling, watershed, and water management. Water is going to be the #1 driver of this program, without a doubt, for the next 10 years. Clean water sources, water volumetrics, looking at sediment loads, looking at erosion, looking at all of the things that influence overland water flow is what this program is tailor-made to do. Tangentially, construction and infrastructure planning. Hard surfaces are particularly accurate with this data, so generation of surfaces onto hard surfaces is really particularly accurate and well done. It's definitely something we see more of a use for. Transportation use, looking at pavement, for example. We're approaching now with the recent quality level and survey enhancements where we can go ahead and figure out, volumetric estimates on pavement, right? That's coming, and it's coming from an airborne side. Resiliency efforts, right? How do we plan for the climate change studies that are ongoing? For how do we become that baseline, right, for that type of application, right? Flood risk assessment. FEMA is hard on this. They've changed the risk map program, and there's some pretty significant changes coming for both assessment of insurance rates for where the floodplain, where the 50 and the 100-year floodplain model land, and this data is going to be right at the very center of that. So if you are a coastal county, if you are looking at floodplain and you need to further analyze where that line is, this is the classic example of how to get funding to help with that. Mining and resource exploration, mining tailings, we see a lot of that up and down the Mississippi River corridor, looking at tailings, looking at dredge information. How do you reclaim land, and then how do you account for that? Big deal. Change detection, disaster recovery, looking at tornado past where tornadoes have cut through, generating everything from volumetric lumber analysis, how much lumber was removed, how much needs to be removed, wildfire planning. We do a lot of this for the U.S. Forest Service, fire behavior modeling, looking at tree canopy. And then, anything from environmental to resource management. So everything related to the ground and what grows above it. And we're doing all of these things right now. It's amazing what's happened really just within the last 10 years. So this data has a really use case story. It pays for itself over and over again, but you have to be aware of what's out there and how it can be used. And we can help with that. So next. So these are just some examples of agencies and potential funding partners and places I've seen agencies help funding. So if you're an urban area or an area that's been looked at as a hub zone or an opportunity zone, that's a new, fairly new, last 5 or 6 years categorization from HUD. But HUD will fund and help fund. I've seen that happen. I've seen it happen in some of the Rust Belt areas around the country as well. The FEMA is, as I mentioned before, the National Park Service is a good one. They recently have funded some areas, more remote areas where if you don't have a big tax base, you're challenged, right? So if you're not a particularly urbanized area, how do you get funding for that? And usually it's through another federal agency. USDA, classic, NRCS, National Resource Conservation Service, has pretty much every county in the country has an NRCS representative. We know a lot of them, and we can help introduce or get you in touch with them. All kinds of funding opportunities there for them. Federal highways, also, if you have federal land in your area that has roads through it, these are, usually could be national parks, that could be military bases, they could be just federal land that's allocated and has highways that run through it. We can help get funding there, at least to ask. And then, the Forest Service, which is the USDA, but they are always looking at ways to improve how they allocate and manage their resources. I'll show a map here in a minute that shows the Western U.S. is significant areas that still have older LiDAR, right? So and that's probably largely, I think, because they have a less of a tax base there. And so different challenges, but federal programs can help fund this. So the infrastructure bill has been the biggest thing that's funded our business really for the past 2 years. It's been like nothing else I've seen in my entire career. Disaster recovery funds have been a big piece of that too. Hurricanes are a big part of that, but also flooding. You're seeing more and more coastal flooding around the country. Whether that's from climate change or any other reason, excess urbanization, these kinds of things are becoming more and more a reality for all of us. Departments of transportation in any given state are great funding sources. It's usually the #1 budget in any state or #2 behind education. Natural resources, environmental management. I'll name them all, but you guys all are typically state agencies here, so you're going to know who has the funding within your state. But what I would say is there's a compelling reason to use LiDAR data in almost all of these. So part of the benefit here is that we get to tell this story. It's a 15-year success story. There's plenty of awesome stories to tell about how this data is being used. So we just need to be engaged in that. And I think it sells itself. Special interest groups, water districts, river basin authorities, councils of government, land trust, cooperatives. These are all in play. The local governments oftentimes become the starting point for these. I've seen many cases where in the BAA days and now DCA days, you had a county that had some money for LiDAR, and they wanted to do this, and they realized if they took the next year and went out and talked to the surrounding counties, they could get large projects done. Next thing you know, you're staring at a 5,000 square mile data set that's 20 to 30% less expensive to do than it would ordinarily have been because of the volume discount that applies here. So the more data we do here, generally the less expensive it gets. So, and really the reason being is that the USGS helps fund it, right? So the idea here is that we spread the cost around. So next. I would be remiss if I didn't talk base minimum LiDAR specifications, but when we talk about the standard today, USGS breaks its specifications down into quality level. So that's LiDAR quality level. This is from the USGS LiDAR base specification, which is published out there. The required deliverables are a point cloud, a bare earth digital elevation model, the first return intensity raster, and then the break lines, which we use to enhance the DEM and Federal Geographic Data Committee metadata, right? So standard stuff. But if you look at the quality levels right now, the de facto standard, what we're delivering more of than anything else is QL1 data, right? So that's a nominal point spacing of 0.35 meters. Typically, that's around 8 points per square meter or better. We collect at slightly more dense than that. But the nominal point spacing is really the measure of on an average square meter how far apart are the points themselves. There's still quite a bit of QL2 data out there, and the QL2 data is normally the older data. That's the stuff we were talking about that's normally 5 years or older. It's still perfectly good data, but it's older. It's not as dense. It's not quite as accurate. QL3 is not really in play anymore. I haven't seen a QL3 project personally in years. But the whole point here is the quality level data is really a measure of the nominal point spacing. And then QL0, which is listed here at also 8 points per square meter, it's more spatially accurate. So it requires more ground survey supplement. But if you're working for the DOT, they may want that, right? They're typically working at more precise data accuracies. They're looking at more design level type data. Now we can go above this, but the USGS is willing to pay for this. QL1, 0 and 1 would be in play here. QL2 we wouldn't turn away, but if it were older data we're trying to replace, I would say the cost benefit for upgrading to a QL1 product makes more sense now because the sensors have gotten to that point where it really is worth it to get the more dense, accurate data than 2 points per square meter versus 8. So either way, we can add additional value to the data, right? With doing hydrographic work, as we talked about, the downstream, literal, all puns intended, downstream work from that. It could lend itself to doing elevation-derived hydrography work. We could do more classification of the data, vegetation classification. We can do building footprints or building outlines. And then merge in bathymetric and sonar type or topobathy LiDAR, right? Additions to this. So the whole point here is that this is a great baseline for adding to value later, three-dimensionally. So next. Again, I'll remind everybody, please pose questions down through the Q&A or through chat. And we'd love to hopefully get a couple questions at the end here. So a defined project area, how do you actually communicate that, right? Project locations with no existing 3-depth LiDAR or data are preferred. There really aren't any in the continental U.S. I don't know if we have anybody online from the Marianas Islands, but your data is not there yet, right? And there's a perfect good example as to why. It's 6,000 linear miles off the U.S. coast, off the continental coast. So there are some areas that haven't been mapped yet, but for the most part, no existing 3-depth data is not a thing anymore. If you have existing 3-depth data but there have been significant changes, so anything over 5 years, for example, is considered old data at this point and reaching the end of its shelf life for value. So we can help you by taking a look at the data. We're going to look at a map here shortly and look at that and go ahead and determine where those areas are in general in the U.S. But I would guess, looking at who's attending here, you tend to know that already. Go ahead, next. So here's the map. This is 3-depth elevation data. If you see there, Alaska down to the bottom left, that's in blue. That's IFSAR, interferometric synthetic aperture radar data that was collected From airplanes. Alaska is a unique animal. It has lots and lots of cloud cover. So IFSAR data was used initially for 3DAT there. It's coarser, but IFSAR sensors penetrate clouds and moisture. So that was initially used, although we are now doing LiDAR projects in Alaska. So if you look at the continental US here, lots of the West Coast has been mapped recently, but tons and tons of the rest of the continental US are still looking at older LiDAR data. And the older data by 5 years doesn't make a judgment on the data. I'm sure it's still good, very good data, but in terms of development and change over time, it's becoming more and more less and less useful to rely upon as a three-dimensional model. So if you're in this area, and I know there are people in this area, if you look at the coastal California, for example, San Diego County is a big one. And then all of New Mexico, a good portion of Texas, not criticizing Texas at all. It's a giant state, right? Hard to manage from that much land area, but also more and more funding opportunities, I think, as that state continues to grow. These are places, right, where we think we have plenty of opportunity to talk to other federal partners about how to get funding done. So just in general, I would go to the USGS website. You can see the address there and look at a couple of different things. There are also places on there you can find interested federal partners, and I won't show that now, but there is a place on the USGS website that you can find interested partners. That doesn't mean they have funding. It just means they're interested in funding. And there's a whole map there that tells you where overlapping federal partners might exist. And then we have to, we're really pretty good at knowing who those partners are, who the actual people are behind that. And so if you're willing to entertain us, we can help you get in touch with us, put you in contact with who you need to put in contact. And if you're looking at next year, that's a great opportunity. So anyway, next. So what is a defined project area? A preferred defined project area, and that's an important distinction here. When we first started 3DEP 15 years ago or so, a preferred project area was anything countywide or larger. Eastern counties are about 400 square miles. Well, now as they've matured the program, typically anything over 1,500 square miles is preferred. Doesn't mean you wouldn't be funded if you have smaller than that area than that. It just means these are typically preferred. The small areas will be considered, especially if they fill in gaps, right, in the baseline coverage, or where, if it completes a geophysical or political unit that hasn't been completed. Some of the counties out west are very large, right, compared to the eastern counties. I know San Diego County is roughly 4,500 square miles. So if it completes an area in Southeast California, for example, or Southwest California, they may give that favor. Where the total area of a project is reduced to overlap with another DCA project submission. So this is where the earlier we know, the better, because we can communicate with the USGS and figure out the lay of the land, so to speak. So if there are other areas that are being applied for, we can coordinate that. And so I would encourage everybody to consider that, particularly if you're looking at next year. This year, we've got an opportunity. I would say if you're definitely interested, we can get something submitted in the next 8 days. That's not a problem. Remembering that it's really a rolling deadline. So go ahead, next. So how do you increase your odds of getting funded? Well, it's all about checking the box and making sure your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. And this is where we typically help our partners, our clients, by really facilitating the submission process. I won't say that we'll write it 100%, but we can help you get there and then allow you to vet through creating a defined project area. There's a 100-meter buffer on top of an AOI that needs to be submitted. There's some definite guidelines on how to submit those. They need to be a standard mapping format. ArcGIS would be the typical de facto standard, but they'll accept other formats as well. But you have to actually define the area, and then we can work with you on setting that up, right? It's more a matter of really what you need to get mapped and how do we represent that to the USGS. Next. 3DHP. So the defined project, remember 3DHP is the hydrologic modeling, and they must be developed from water boundary data sets or HUC units, hydrologic units. And so there's specific guidelines for that. These HUCs are 8s, 10s, and 12s, and they're really a matter of scale. Those are typically mapping units, and they're normally laid out by watershed. And what's interesting about the merger, I won't call it a merger of 3DHP and 3DAT, but over time, we've collected the country as a block, but these watersheds are not blocked, right? So, I know that we're looking at collecting by watershed. There's a lot of different discussions going right now on how to best represent those watersheds hydrologically. So I think you'll see some changes, but if you want to define your project for watershed modeling, you need to do it by hydrologic unit. And the address there is where you can go to figure out where HUCs are and what they are. And, if you're in, the challenge here is if you're in an administrative boundary, you're a state, you're a county, you're a cog, you need to consider the fact that a HUC may run outside your cog. It may include areas outside that, and the USGS is typically only going to fund areas that include the entire HUC. And it makes sense. Water doesn't stop at a state line, and it doesn't stop at a county boundary. So we want to map what makes sense here. Next. So the DCA was released on August 5th. So we're now 1 month into that, right? And project submissions must be received digitally by Friday, September 13th. Oh, great. Friday the 13th. But after, they'll still consider project submissions after the deadline, but they have to be reviewed until no remaining funds exist. So we need to consider that as long as we get something in by the 13th at 5. By something, I say typically these are 5 to 10 page submissions, of which almost half of which is rote stuff that you have to put together, the map of the study area, a narrative on the justification, and the extension of funds, right? Where the funds are going to come from. If you have some seed funding that you know of, right, that you already got into a budget, I would say let's consider it for this year. If you're still kind of thinking about it, that's no big deal. We can look at next year. There's no emergency, no rush, but it's still very, very feasible to get something put together for next Friday, if you like. Next. So how the FY26 application process would work. And this is where I'd say our odds, if you're looking at a much larger area here, by larger area, anything over 1,500 square miles that you haven't considered yet. This would be something I generally recommend unless you already have 75% of the funding. We need to strategize. We need to sit down and talk with you about whether you're looking at LiDAR, whether you're looking at hydrology as your focus. Get a cost estimate together. That has to be refined. Typically, the first run at that usually ends up being refined to some level. And then we go out and we help you find funding partners, right? Or you can find them yourself. I'm sure most of you are adept at that, but we're pretty good at it, and we do it for a living, and it's in our interest, and we won't deny that. So the cost sharing pieces of this are big, and you'd be surprised at what pops out of the woodwork once you've established that you want to do this. So again, I would strongly consider, if you're looking at next year, to get started early. And by early, I mean like November of this year, right? We need to be talking about it, because the whole point here is by September of next year, when the next DCA is out, if we have all of our ducks in a row, your odds of being funded are probably higher, definitely higher. The fiscal year budget request has to be put in place, considering the fact that for this year, we're talking about FY25 funds. So everything has to be put in place. Generally, the finalized plan, everything in the application needs to be in place by the end of the year, right? So we submit the app if we do it next week, and by the end of the year, the details all have to be ironed out. The who, the what, the contractor, how much funding exists, and who the funding partners are, and the USGS contribution. So this can be time consuming. If you're looking at working this year, the only thing I would say is that if you're looking at submitting this year, if you have funding in place now, you should potentially consider it. If you don't, we'll work with you, and we'll do that through the next year and give it some time to put it all together. We're pretty patient about this stuff. It takes time, it takes alignment, and it takes consensus. And so that does sometimes take time to put together. We're happy to have to work with you on that. Next. So how to plan for getting more out of the program update. I talked about this later, integrating the data visualization tools, spatial analysis, being able to merge and fuse data for environmental use, for water modeling, for 3D modeling, for extracting infrastructure data, building outlines, building footprints, three-dimensional data, higher resolution and quality level data, those derivative products I mentioned. You can contract for a higher resolution, more dense data set through this. But the USGS is only going to be willing to match funding on the base price of a QL quality level 0, 1, 0 through 3 data set. So next. So in the end, what we're saying here is we can help. If you want to submit this year, we'd love to help you out with that and discuss it. But if you're also looking at next year, I don't want to downplay that. This is the time to be thinking about it, and oftentimes taking that extra year can mean a lot of difference in funding partnerships and the overall effectiveness of the program. So I'm going to go ahead and look at a question from Jane. All right, Jane. So the question is, has Sanborn produced 3D HP data that has been accepted by the USGS? And the answer to that question is yes. We have had data in Alaska recently accepted. And we've done 3 projects up through Alaska. Alaska is an interesting, unique animal, often actually more difficult, I think, to work with than some of the areas in the continental US. But yes, we have, and we are being contracted currently to do LiDAR data in the Northeast US. So we do have an accepted data set. So these are things that we feel like we're an interesting option for 3DHP because we are not an engineering firm, right? We're a data firm. So we come at it from a different angle, and we've got some automated processes, some ability to find culverts that we've created that are unique, we think, and that we'd love to talk to you about, Jane. So yeah, we have done that. And then we have a question here. You had the same specs for QL 0 and 1. The only difference, that's the difference between QL 0 and QL 1 is the accuracy, the actual spatial accuracy of QL 0 versus QL 1. The point density is the same. And the accuracy of QL 0 is basically the way we derive additional spatial accuracy is by creating more ground control, right? Verification and validation. Although it's the same density, we can actually collect at a higher level of density for either of those, right? But at the end of the day, the way that you enhance the accuracy of the data, this vertical and the horizontal, is to apply more ground control to that. I hope that makes sense, Jason. Thanks. So I will open it up further to questions. Let's see. And we'll leave it open for a couple of minutes here. And I genuinely appreciate everybody's time. Mr. Lesko, I'm sure you have a question. And okay, I'm going to give it 30 more seconds, but I genuinely appreciate your help. My contact information and email is listed below. Again, I would encourage you to take a look at this 2 ways, well, really 4 ways. 2 ways looking at timelines for next Friday, 5 to 10 pages put together to submit for this year. And Jane, we'd love to talk to you about that because I think you're in an area that's relevant, very relevant as where you are. But I'd also look at next year as well. So if you're looking at a much larger area, it may be fine to look for next year, and we can go help you find funding for that too. Okay, if there, so I will leave it at that. Thank you guys for attending today. I look forward to communicating with you, and best of luck. We'd love to talk to you further. And if you have any questions, feel free to pose them later.